Alright, so one of the biggest problems I had in getting this PC up and running was getting a power supply big enough and yet also small enough to be able to run all of the components that I have. And as it happens, the server PSUs are pretty much the only thing that fits the bill in terms of being able to fit inside the chassis, but also providing the power that I need. However, there's one big issue in that none of these server PSUs come with any sort of rails to allow me to easily connect sort of different parts to them and then also be able to run everything that I need to run at the same time. So what I've come up with is taking this copper bus bar that would normally be used in a car. I will then be attaching it to the ground and live wires, which are the two really fat terminals you see right there at the very end of the PSU, using a chip quick solution, which is basically just low temperature solder, and then using resistance soldering to get them properly attached. So let's take a look at the bus bar now, and then also how this will all come together. So this here is the copper bus bar typically used in cars. I will link the one that I used in my video description so you guys can take a look. Now this part will need to be cut down just a little bit so that I can fit all of it onto the separate hot and also ground stations of the PSU itself. At that point, we will be essentially able to screw in wires into the copper bus bar, thus allowing us to power external units. So after cutting these apart using my specialized tools, I'm then going to apply the low temperature solder to the backside of these little bus bars so that I can then use resistance soldering to solder them onto our actual power supply. Now, in order to prep the connections on the power supply itself, I've also put some of this low temp solder on these connectors here, and I will also be using, again, the resistance soldering technique to melt this really quickly without melting off any of the other components using something like a hot air station. Alright, and here we have more or less the final product. As you can see, we're now able to unscrew the little screw-in caps to allow wires to be fed into those areas. Also having, again, the ground and also the 12-volt hot output, so we can plug in whatever devices we want, so long as all they need is ground and 12-volt. Now, something to keep in mind is that these server PSUs are not just going to run without being plugged into an actual server blade, so we will need to make the following modifications here in order to get it to run, which is soldering a 22 kilo ohm resistor in the pads that you see there, and then also soldering that first pin right there over to the ground so that we can actually turn this on properly. Now, the other part here is that if you don't want the PSU to stay on all the time, you can also, instead of just making a ground connection, you can connect a switch in those areas where you would otherwise have the ground wire. This will allow you to flip a switch on and off, which then will trigger the power supply to obviously turn on, and you'll have live power going to all of your electronics. Now, there is another part missing here which normally would not be able to work with the server PSUs, which is that we still need a way to turn on the motherboard and provide CPU power somehow. And the best way I found to achieve this is to actually get a Pico PSU. It doesn't really matter what particular sort of value for the output that you get, although something that supports your CPU at the very least is going to be pretty important. And at that point, what we're going to do, in my case, for the sake of being able to save space, I'm going to disconnect the 24 pin and just connect the wires directly so that I can have a really low profile connector. However, for your guys' case, more than likely you'll just want to keep that 24 pin so that you can plug that directly into the motherboard at that point. And at this stage, the only part that you really need to worry about is connecting the ground and power cables that you see right there, the black and the red, back into your PSU using the bus bar that we soldered to it earlier. So now normally at this point you would be done if you were running your PSU in the regular kind of chassis, meaning inside of its enclosure. However, in my case, because I'm also going to be running it as an open frame PSU, I'm also going to need to ground the actual PSU to the chassis, and that's something that I can cover in a little bit more detail in the next video. However, for most intents and purposes, at this point you would be square to go once you've connected, again, the power from the Pico PSU back to the actual PSU that we're going to be using, and you'll be able to simply plug in the server PSU into the wall socket, and then it will power on, provided that you also soldered everything correctly on the actual terminals that allow it to power on.